Like Thomas said, thank you, AdCom, Phoenix, and Edible, everybody that's worked to make this happen. This is really cool. I've recently moved back to Cleveland in the past year from New York City, and communities like this in New York are prevalent. They're all over the place. So seeing this here is just another thing that's helping to make us just a world-class city. So give yourselves a round of applause. Like, this is awesome. Everybody felt I'm speaking with you here today about climate, and Thomas gave a little bit about why I'm here, and I kind of just want to give you a little bit of background on myself, and we'll introduce the lecture. So this is an analysis of the gastronomic climates of Cleveland. So if you're not sure what the term gastronomy is, or gastronomic is, the study of food, and it's extremely encompassing. It's everything from soil types on farms and why they produce food of a certain flavor, which is terroir, to setting a table right in a restaurant and why we have all those different forks and knives and different drinking glasses. So gastronomy is very comprehensive, and it also includes the academic aspect of food, whether it's food science, food philosophy, the physiology of taste, how our tongue interprets food and sends those signals to our brain. So gastronomy is very, very broad, and it's a wonderful thing to reflect on the climates of gastronomy. So that's what we're going to take a look at. So a little bit about me. I've worked as a chef. I've been a farmer, a food activist, a good food activist. You can interpret that however you want, but Taco Bell is not good food. I forage. I've started up a food startup internet company, which we just recently sold. So I've done a lot with food. I've worked on it for almost all my life. My grandmother was a kosher caterer here in Cleveland. She had me in the kitchens around the time I was 10, 11 years old working with her. So food has been a lifelong love of my life, and not just cooking it, but eating it, growing it, working with it, spreading the love of food amongst everybody. So right now, I'm a wild food forager and a larder master. Does anybody in here know what a larder master does? I'm the master of a larder. That's it. And what that means is a larder is akin to a root cellar. A lot of us, our grandparents, or even some of you that are a little older, remember a root cellar being in the house, and it's an area of the house where you could make sauerkraut or hang a ham or have your family's wine stored, and it's typically a basement. So at Trentino, we have a larder. I do everything from producing cultured butter to making speck, which is similar to prosciutto, to brewing vinegar, vegetable ferments, and so on. We'll get into that in a little bit later. What I also do is I forage wild plants and mushrooms. And a lot of people don't realize how much food is actually out there. You have to think our whole civilization as a species was built on foraging and going out and finding our food. No food that you eat today, you would not be able to experience it if it weren't for us going out, grabbing these plants, grabbing mushrooms, capturing animals, breeding them out to what they exist as today. So foraging is the cornerstone of our humanity. So is gathering food and then cooking it. I also use modern culinary technologies and sciences to create archaic foodstuffs. So what's an archaic foodstuff? At Trentina, I make something called garum. Garum is a fish sauce. It was first written about by Apicius about 3,500 years ago, roughly. I could be a little off on my dates, but it's very ancient food. And I create other ancient foods too, all types of cured meat, fish, cheese. You have to think things like beer, cheese. I mean, those are foods that we've been producing for, give or take, 10,000 years. We would kill an animal. We found out that its stomach was a great bag, and we would keep milk in it, and eventually we had cheese. Grains would be left out, and they'd ferment, and we found out we could drink the liquid, our fresh fruits, and get drunk. So these foods have been around for a long time. We take them for granted and what they are and how they got here. But the great thing about the work that I'm doing and working with Chef Sawyer and the team at Trentina is we're able to bring those foods, give them modern sensibilities, and allow you to relate to them and experience them. So, what is climate? And is Cleveland unique? Are our climates unique? And what even are our climates within Cleveland? So this is straight from the dictionary here. There's 3 breakdowns of what climate is. So we have a region of the earth having specified climatic conditions, which would be weather patterns, temperature, wind, precipitation. We have a prevailing set of conditions indoors. Right now, the climate in here is pretty nice, 72 degrees, not too humid. It's really nice, room temperature, right? And then also the prevailing influence or environmental conditions characterizing a group or period, as in the example here, a climate of fear, or on the flip side, a climate of joy, or as we're specifically going to get into, a gastronomic climate. So the 3 climates that I've identified in Cleveland that relate to food are the ecological and environmental, and those 2 have to go hand in hand with each other. One can't exist without the other. We have to make sure the ecology as a whole is functioning for the environment to be a good place. We have the gastronomic, which once again brings us back to that word gastronomy. So that is essentially the food scene, what all the foodies are doing. And microscopic, which is really integral to my work as a larder master. I spend more time with bacteria than I do my wife and daughter. We all do, by the way. So, ecological and environmental. So this specifically, this is textbook scientific definition about the climate we live in here in Cleveland. So it's a humid continental climate, which means we have 4 distinct seasons. That could be variable, but we have 4 distinct seasons. We have year-round precipitation. We don't have like a dry season and then a monsoon. We get precipitation year-round. Seasonal average temperatures ranging from 29 degrees Fahrenheit to 75 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's the window of, over the course of the year, that's what the temperatures span out to be. And we have a diverse flora and fauna. Those are plants and animals and everything outside in the wild. So wild foods are stupendous. If anybody's ever been to Trentina, you'll eat like you've never eaten before. Just right here is a little sample of some of the foods that we have. We use a lot of them. Right here, just on the board, we have 3 different types of wild apples. We have wood sorrel, which is a green. We have a lot of mint, poor man's pepper, nettles, wild grapes, lamb's quarters, common mallow, ramps, purslane, sheep sorrel, and then the mushrooms we have around the bottom ring there. There's 3 different types of chanterelles, oyster mushrooms, maitake, also known as hen of the woods, hedgehog mushrooms, and another mushroom called chicken of the woods. Most of the foraging I do, I haven't even explored the west side yet. Most of the area I kind of covered. And one of the things that we work with just in the realm of what the restaurant uses, we're very fortunate to have benefactors and friends of the restaurant that have zoned agricultural lands that allow me to forage. And that's really important, that these wild foods come from areas that we know aren't contaminated, they're used for food production. It's just a level of safety in our modern culture that has to be taken with these foods. So while you can go outside in the summer here and pick a weed out of the sidewalk and potentially eat it, I don't necessarily recommend that. So with foraging, at Trentina, we just opened in July. So in the roughly 8 months that we've been open, we've served over 150 species of wild plants at Trentina. And out of those, we get just about 400 usable parts. For example, a lot of people, I'll show you a slide of milkweed in a moment, but milkweed's a wonderful plant, and most of us know that as the plant that monarch butterflies live on. They eat. Well, it's really good for us too. And milkweed itself at Trentino, we get 5 unique different vegetables. And I'm going to put vegetables in quotes. This past November, I had the fortunate opportunity, Team Sawyer and some other chefs from around the Midwest, we got to host, in conjunction with the Museum of Contemporary Art with MoCA, Chef Ferran Adria. And those of you that don't know who Ferran Adria is, he's the equivalent, he's to food what Einstein was to physics and astral studies. There has probably been no greater or more artistic or inventive chef in the history of the world than this gentleman. So he came to Cleveland, we got to hang out, and I took him foraging, and we sat down and we ate lunch together, and he said, well, all these foods, you can't call these vegetables because vegetable denotes that it's cultivated. He said, what you're doing is something completely different. You can't call those 5 parts you get from milkweed vegetables because they're wild and they're not cultivated. What are you gonna call them? I still don't know. I've been losing sleep over this since he told me that. I'll get there eventually. So we use, all these plants, we get all these different parts. And it's really remarkable because when you start looking at foods this way as to one food, let's even take something domestic like collard greens. Like all we think of is a leaf, but you can eat the leaf in different stages. You can eat it when it's a young leaf, you can eat it when it's fully fleshed out. If you let the plants overwinter and then go to flower the next year, you get these flower heads that come up that look like broccoli rabe, but they're collards. So you can use the flower buds, you can use the flowers, you can use that whole piece on top with the flower on it and cook it as a whole vegetable. So examining wild foods in these manner, it's no surprise that we get 400 usable parts from these 150 plants. You just have to be able to dissect and find out what's good, what's edible, and assign it a culinary value. Just because you think, if anybody juices here, just because all that pulp in your juicer, you think it's been spent, I create a lot of stuff with that pulp at Trentino. So there's always a value that can be assigned or reassigned to a food to continue it on. We've served 70 different species of edible fungi at Trentino since we opened in July in Cleveland. That's pretty sweet. It's really sweet. Literally we are serving food that no one's eaten on a popular basis. There are people out there that go out and hobby forage or even freelance forage and work with these foods, but they don't achieve this scope. And part of the reason is a lot of the other foragers out there, they're freelance. So they're only gonna give the chefs what the chefs want. I have the opportunity to bring in ingredients to the restaurant and tell the chefs, this is something that we can give a value to and we can serve it. So it's really, really wonderful experience. I explain, vegetable in quotes, so I do explore the realm between foraged and cultivated. At Trentina, I've taken samples from fungi, their spore samples and their mycelium, which is their rooting network. I've inoculated the wood chips and wood piles around Trentina in these garden zones. So now, come this year, I'm gonna have 4 different species of wild fungi that are essentially gonna be cultivated on Trentina's grounds. Also created habitat in our small little wood beds, and they're tiny. It's a strip about this wide that runs from about me to the wall. In there, I've also transplanted all sorts of wild plants that I found around Case's campus. After talking with their grounds crews, the areas where they don't spray and where they have healthy habitat, taken these plants and replanted them on Trentina's ground. So we'll have, just if we're in a pinch and we need something really quick, we can go out and grab it. So that's one of the other things. And directly with climate change and instability in different ecosystems and the environment puts all this in danger. Like, this is great, but is my daughter gonna be able to experience this food? That's the question we all have to ask. And my experience with climate, I find all these foods, we use them all at the restaurant, everything looks good and rosy and dandy. But I continually notice that the habitat that was no longer is, and the ones that are there are constantly transforming. So whether things can continue to be supported in the way they are, we've got to change our ways. We have to look at things, we have to look at pollution, we have to look at urban development, we have to examine all these things, see how the climate is being impacted and why the natural ecosystems are being thrown off. And me, it's a matter of job security. This is my livelihood. This is honestly my livelihood. This is how I put food on the table for my family. This is how I pay down my student loans slowly. You know, this is here's a few plants that we have here. On the left, this is Cornus moss. Common name for this is carnelian cherry. We do some really interesting things about this. So this is a type of dogwood, if you're familiar with dogwood trees. The fruit is akin to a wild plum. What I do with these at Trentina, you can see the little fruits down on the bottom right in that picture. I take those when they're green like that. They're extremely astringent, which is like a drying feeling in the mouth and a little bitter. And I cure them in lye, and then I brine them. That's a saltwater solution they hang out in of different levels. And then I pack them in new harvest olive oil from Italy. That process, I started it in July and wrapped it up in November when we got the new harvest olive oil. So now what we have, we call them Ohio olives. I've a few colleagues that go to France all the time and are familiar with French olives are like, this is undeniably, unmistakably a French olive. Something like a Picholine. Yet it's a wild plum. So able to take these foods, something that normally isn't eaten, especially in this stage, reassign its culinary value. You know, and I'll get into the climate needed to create a food like that in a little bit. On the top right, we have stinging nettle, which if anybody's ever cut their lawn and you live out on the far east side or far west side, you're familiar with stinging nettles. They sting. Sometimes they really suck. I've got to wear heavy-duty leather gloves when I harvest them. It's 90 degrees in the summer and I'm harvesting them and I got long sleeves on, 2 layers and pants and leather gloves. But they're a delicious food and we get several parts from them. We most widely at Trentina use this in place of spinach. You know, the great thing about my work and me being part of the team is we don't have to spend money on ingredients because I just bring them in. So it's wonderful. And then down at the bottom right, we have something called staghorn sumac. This plant is awesome, and I love foraging for it. It's very prehistoric looking, and whenever I'm like out in the groves of sumac, I like always look over my shoulder. I think like velociraptors are about to run outside. This is the Rhus family. That's the Latin name, R-H-U-S. They are a very ancient class of plants. And most people are familiar with sumac being used in Middle Eastern spice in the za'atar mix. Sumac is red, so we take those berry cones, those red berries. They dry out really easily. They produce lots of citric acid. In fact, if you look at them, the berries look like they're covered in these crystalline spikes. So there's citric acid on the outside, has this berry flavor, and we use this as our house seasoning at Trentina. It's a wonderful plant. It grows everywhere. It's all along the sides of the highways. It's just, you can't miss it. Here's the famous milkweed. And if you look at the center on the top, it's called milkweed because it puts out a milky sap. And it's wonderful. All these different parts here, we use as different vegetables. And it's just delicious. You can't get enough of it. Here's a few examples of some of the mushrooms that we serve at Trentina. Most of us are familiar with just a few mushrooms. We know portobello, we know cremini, and we know white button. Well, here's something for you to think about. All 3 of those mushrooms are technically agaricus bisporus. So those are all the same mushroom genetically. They're just different varieties. So, of course, different in color, but a portobello is just a mature cremini mushroom. Now, granted, in different stages of growth, they do have different properties in terms of texture and their flavor and how they're worked with, but it's the same mushroom. So when you come to Trentina and you die, we have russulas over here, classification of mushrooms. They're awesome. When I was studying and learning about foraging and trying to figure out how to identify a russula, you do something called the shatter test. They're really brittle. The common name for this mushroom is the green brittle gill. So I said to the person I'm studying with, well, how do I know I found a russula? I said, do the shatter test. You pick it and you just kind of toss it against something and it'll shatter, and then you know it's a russula. And I'm thinking, okay, this is great, but do you ever get to eat them? Like if you're picking them all in the test, and as you learn more, you learn other ways to identify them. It's one of my favorite mushrooms. It grows all over this area. It's wonderful. It's this kind of hard to see, but these wonderful shades of olive or like seafoam green. In the top right, that's a Talipelus alliboter. It's also known as the black velvet bolete. It feels like velvet, and it's black in color. And when you cut it open, sometimes they're black inside, sometimes they're white, but they color change due to reaction with oxygen into this beautiful pink color on the inside. It's delicious, and that's in the same family as porcini mushrooms, essentially, the same general family. And then we have here a lion's mane mushroom. This is Hericium. It used to be Hericium iranius, which is the name of this mushroom just in Europe. Now this is Hericium americanus here in North America. We found out it's genetically different, but it's wonderful. I mean, it looks like icicles falling down. This comes up in the summer. It has some flavonoid compounds in it that are also found in crustaceans. So it has this wonderful shrimpy or almost lobster-like taste to it, especially when it's poached in butter. It's delicious and it's gorgeous. And then here's chanterelles. This year alone, I pulled 250 pounds of chanterelles out of Cleveland Heights. So if any of you live in Cleveland Heights, you know, they're out there. And they're a wonderful mushroom. There's 5 different species of chanterelles that grow in this area. Before on the picture of the wild food board, there was 3 different ones there. So lots of mushrooms. All right, so our gastronomic climate. Things that contributed to this and what makes up this climate. And you know, going back just a step, we look at all these things individually. You can find these different climates all across the world in different places. But the combination of them and how they come together here is what makes us unique. This is what makes our environmental climate unique, it's what makes our food climate unique, and also my microbial climates at work. So we have an amazing array of talented chefs and food producers. I work for Jonathan Sawyer. He's awesome. If you guys have never met him or hung out or ate at his restaurants, go say hello. He's the nicest guy in the world. We've got people like Doug Katz, and we have Shane Culley, and we have Brandon Korostovsky. Like, these are wonderful people doing awesome things with food in Cleveland. Go to all their restaurants, enjoy all their food. We get consistent national attention. All the time, there's major publications writing about the food in Cleveland and what we're doing here. Don't be surprised by this anymore. We're awesome. All right, don't be shocked when you see this. It's a direct reflection of the diversity of our cultures. All right? So you're not going to have food from different parts of the world if you don't have people from different parts of the world. So our broad gastronomic food scene, in terms of you can go and you can eat Oaxacan food off of Lorraine Avenue, you know, food from central Mexico. You can go to Asia Town. We have the only Asia Town in all of Ohio. And you can eat a wide variety of different ethnic foods. Szechuan cafe is phenomenal if you like that food from China. You know, there's a few Vietnamese restaurants. We have good Japanese food. It just goes on and on. And it's a direct reflection of the people here. We have a sound economic climate. You know, I know things are tough. Like, I definitely go back and forth, living from paycheck to paycheck, depending on what my student loan payments are that month. But people are still going out to eat. And we have that little bit of extra money, we're gonna go enjoy it in a way that we see fit, and people are going out to eat and having a great night. And in my eyes, that means that something's going pretty well, you know? Little positive news on the economy for you. We have a large concentration of educated consumers. If you don't know what something is, chances are you're not gonna eat it. So you have exposure to educational materials, whether they're some stupid show on the Food Network or a serious food blog, like something out of one of the Culinary Institutes. So we're educated, we know what different foods are, we're intrigued by different foods if we haven't eaten them yet, so we go and we seek them out. And this allows restaurateurs to produce food that's thrilling, exciting, delicious, and even challenging. Delicious creative food is an integral component to successful and driven educational and artistic cultures. That's just a play off of what I just said. You know, you want, if a chef wants to create something that in itself, it's more than just food, it transcends and it becomes art, and it becomes culture, and it becomes biodiversity and ethnicity all on a plate. That's a reflection of the education that the diner has and the art in the community. So these are all intertwined. Food, I believe, is the bedrock and the cornerstone of our way of life and our civilizations. And once again, in relation to the sound economic climate, things are pretty affordable. I just moved here from New York City. Things are really affordable, in case you're wondering. You know, some of our communities and the climates within them, we have one of the world's oldest publicly owned markets, or the nation's oldest publicly owned markets. opened in 1912. The West Side Market is a gem. It's awesome. Go there all the time. Support the local vendors. Other neighborhoods around town, we have Playhouse Square. There isn't too much food there yet, but there will be really soon. East 4th Street, that's where the Greenhouse Tavern is. Chef Sawyer, one of Chef Sawyer's restaurants. Great place to go eat. And Tremont and the food trucks that show up there. You know, there's a lot to do. There's a lot of different food to experience. So, we've talked about a little bit about environmental and ecological, talked about the gastronomic climate here in Cleveland, and the microscopic. So this is what I deal with. Part of my job as a larder master. Preserved foods, they're fascinating and delicious. They can be extremely complex. I make different vegetable ferments that have similar flavor compounds in them found in salami. So you eat them and you're like, this is a turnip or a radish, but it tastes like salami. What's going on here? So those foods are really, really fascinating and delicious. How they're developed, how they're made, how they're eaten. And they have immense amounts of historical and current gastronomic importance. Historically speaking, you would eat a lot of preserved food and a lot of heavily spiced food. There was no refrigeration, so you needed to eat different types of cured meats. You needed to take milk, which can spoil, and turn it into yogurt or turn it into cheese, something that could be stable at ambient temperature. And now, you know, those things have grown out of, for some of us it's a necessity, but otherwise we really enjoy them and we like those foods and we want them to stick around. These foods need specific microclimates. It's very important that when you're making these foods, they're within the guidelines of certain environments, certain microclimates. And they need those to be made and they need them to continue existing. So there's I've broken down two different areas of the microscopic climates. And we have a bacterial / microbial, and we have an autolytic / enzymatic. And then also the human cataclysm. This is going to be my favorite part. So bacterial and microbial. Here's a listing of kind of what some different general rules. Now this differs from thing to thing, but generally speaking, most vegetable ferments need to be in a 3 to 7% brine. So that's a solution of salt in water. And need to be held at 50 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Anything lower than that, it doesn't really ferment. Anything over that, it doesn't really ferment. And what's actually working to ferment? So there's different types of bacteria, and with the vegetable ferment, mainly you have something called lactobacillus. There's all different types of lactobacillus. And these bacteria, they're in your nose, they're on your skin, they're all throughout your body, they're on every plant that comes from every farm. And if we put them in this environment, those lactobacillus start eating starches and sugars found in the vegetables, even vegetables that you don't think of having starches and sugars, like cabbage. And they eat it, and they eat it, and they convert it, and they essentially poop out lactic acid, which is what gives sauerkraut its sourness, or any other pickle its sourness. So next time you eat sauerkraut, think that you're eating bacteria poop, and that's what makes it so good. So it needs to be in that environment for that process to happen. Fermented meat can also be affected by different types of lactobacillus bacteria, but there's also a wider range of molds and even yeast that can contribute to the fermentation process there. So most fermented meats, and we can even count cured meats in there, such as prosciutto or different types of soppressata, mixed sausages, they need to lose roughly 30% of their weight, and that's the water coming out of them. And held at 50 to 65 degrees Fahrenheit with around 90% humidity. So that's the specific climate that a ham needs to hang in to become prosciutto. Most bacteria that ferment dairy need to be held between 75 degrees Fahrenheit and 110 degrees Fahrenheit. I make ridiculous amounts of yogurt at Trentina. I've got wonderful scientific equipment that I can use to streamline the process and make it really efficient. So I set up this thing called an immersion circulator. It'll hold water at a very specific temperature. I've narrowed down with the strains of bacteria that I use and the milk that we source locally, the best temperature for making our yogurt to come out at the flavor profile and consistency that we want is 109.6 degrees Fahrenheit. So I'm able to hold our yogurt in that water for about 24 hours. After that, I take it out and I let it sit at room temperature for another 24 hours. And we have this wonderful yogurt that we use. So the autolytic and enzymatic. And one thing to kind of keep in mind is, A, what the hell are these words and what do they mean? But these words, these processes, can also happen with fermented vegetables. They're kind of all intertwined. But because they can be done separately from each other, I've broken them up. So these rely on similar climates to vegetable ferments. They're typically also microbial ferments, relying on bacteria or yeast or molds to help them. And what makes them enzymatic is they use enzymes found in the ingredients or added to help the curing process. For those of you that aren't sure what an enzyme is, it's a catalyst that breaks something else down. So there's enzymes in your saliva that start breaking down your food before they go to your stomach and get broken apart by the acids in your stomach. So autolytic means that it's the name of the process given for something that's essentially technically self-digesting itself. So its own enzymes are breaking it down and turning it into something else. Now, these processes are controlled, an autolytic reaction can be incredibly delicious. Fish sauce is not technically fermented, but fish bones and guts and heads are salted, and the enzymes are released out of their flesh by the salt that's drawn out in their water, breaks down over time into its constituent amino acids and becomes this wonderful savory condiment. That's an autolytic process. It's also slightly enzymatic. So you see, there's our group of, these are all our chefs from our different restaurants with Team Sawyer, the Greenhouse Tavern, Noodlecat, and Trentina. And there's a jar kind of sitting up there. This is a enzymatic and microbial ferment that I'm extremely fascinated with. We'll get into in just a moment. Here's a few other examples of autolytic and enzymatic ferments. So on the left here, those are mussels that are in a 3% brine. Over time, mussels actually don't break down, but their juices are leached out, essentially. Those are broken down into amino acids, and we have something that's akin to a fish sauce, but made from mussels. And then we can, because the brine isn't so salty, 3% is roughly around, it's a little higher than seawater, but it's on the low end of what a pickled food would be. A new pickle, if you've ever had that, is around a 3% brine. Like a kosher dill is around a 5% brine. So you can kind of gauge the appearance of those pickles and the saltiness. So these are 3%. So now we can use those mussels in the food too, and use the extract made from them. On the bottom here, these are lobster eggs. So if you've ever eaten Italian food, you may be familiar with a product called botarga. So botarga is the egg sacs taken from a fish. It's salted, and it's allowed to dry out, and then it's used as an accoutrement, as a garnish on food to enhance the flavor, and it's generally shaved over. Well, I use lobster eggs to do this at Trentino. The really cool thing about them is you can see they're a little red here, but they're mainly green or black, and as soon as they hit heat, they go through a denaturization process, the proteins, and they release these wonderful color pigments in the egg, so it goes from this greenish black color, we shave it table side, and then it turns red before your eyes. It's really fascinating. You know, this is a very old technique, curing eggs from an animal this way, and our understanding of science and climate now enables us to do fun things like to have color-changing eggs on a plate and serve it tableside in a restaurant. It's a fascinating reaction, but if you don't understand why it's happening or how it's happening, you can't assign a value to it. On the top is koji, aspergillus. Excuse my Latin, I don't speak it. So koji, anybody in here enjoy sake or miso soup, soy sauce? So this is a mold that I grow on spent rice that we use in one of our dishes. We use the rice to add starch to a broth that we use. I take that spent rice and I inoculate it with a mold, and I grow koji, and then I turn that into different types of miso paste, different types of sake, which I then ferment out into different types of rice vinegars. And this is also used brewing soy sauce. But because Trentina is an Italian restaurant, I'm using garbanzo beans instead of soybeans for our soy sauce. And what happens here is this mold grows on the rice. As it's growing, it breaks down the sugars in there, and it essentially supplants all the enzymes that are left over from that breaking down of the sugars in there, and allows those enzymes to start the autolytic process to convert those other foods into what they are. So it is allowed to, those enzymes are breaking down the beans and turning into miso. And then that liquid is taken off of there and it's turned into soy sauce. So those are autolytic enzymatic processes. So you all have a question on your name tag, right? Has anybody fermented anything before? I talked to a couple people that did. I ferment everything all the time. They were joking in the restaurant yesterday that I literally just opened a bottle of red wine and put a pineapple peel in it that I had at home. We don't use pineapple at Trentina, but I'd put a little bit of pineapple in it, and 8 days later we have a batch of vinegar. Vinegar on average takes 3 to 6 months to make. So they joke that I'm just a walking ferment and that I touch something and it just converts over. Good thing I don't drink anymore. So the answer is you're constantly fermenting. It's part of our digestive process. There's microbes that live in your gut that ferment your food to help you break it down and extract nutrients from it. That's why you fart. Byproduct of that process is gas. So you're all constantly fermenting. Whether you've brewed beer at home or made wine or made pickles, you're fermenting anyways. So this leads us to my latest obsession. This is the wonders within us and others. So you and your bioarmy are just one big ferment. You are essentially, you're made up of tons of different microclimates working together to form one climate to produce something. All that you eat is fermented during digestion. And around the world, there's various peoples from different cultures that use the human body to produce food. And it's more than just working with our hands. You know, it's not just cutting and chopping and putting something in a jar and putting salt on it. It's actually using processes of our body to make food. And, you know, this seems weird, using us to make food, but we've been doing this with other animals for centuries, for millennia even. I brought up beer and cheese before. You know, cheese traditionally made in the stomachs of veal and lamb. You know, if you kind of think about it, so you're taking something that came out of the mother of this animal, killing the animal, putting the milk in this animal's stomach, letting it hang out in warm temperatures for a few days, and then deciding, I'm gonna eat this? So when you break down like that, the use of our bodies or other animals' bodies to use their systems as a way to produce food, as opposed to just them, it's not so foreign, and it happens all the time. A lot of people that like coffee, and Phoenix does awesome coffee. I'm pretty amped up right now, thank you. Have you heard of civet or black ivory coffees? Civets are a type of cat, and black ivory coffee comes from elephants. So they feed these specific types of coffees, the beans, the fresh beans, to these animals. The animals then poop out the seed that's left over, which is the actual bean. And then they sell that coffee for $300 to $500 per cup. And a lot of people buy it. I've had civet coffee before. It's pretty damn good. So, using the human body as a catalyst for food production. If anybody's familiar with Andean cultures in South America, there's a alcoholic ferment called chicha de maize. The Spanish is a little off, but what chicha is they take corn mash and they chew it up, and then they spit it into a spittoon, and they add some water and they let it ferment, and then they have a beer. And this is drinking a lot, and it's been drank for centuries. There's people around the world that use breast milk for food for themselves, not just for their babies. They turn it into cheese, they turn it into yogurt. There was a chef in New York City, I think in 2001 or 2011, that came under heat for actually serving breast milk cheese from his wife at his restaurant. So it happens. I found some archaic literature that talked about a small town in the south of France where they've been using breast milk from wet nurses. So essentially, there'd be periods of time when they'd always maintain that there was wet nurses in the town, just in case a mother couldn't nurse, that there was always somebody lactating. And there would be times that there was no babies, but they wanted to keep people lactating, so they're like, what do we do with this milk? And they started making a cheese, and it became a delicacy. So, this is chicha style vinegar. That picture of all our chefs before and that big jar sitting there, we had just passed around some local apples and chewed them and spit them into a jar. And they've been fermented out. Right now, that jar, I just measured it the other day, it's at 14% alcohol. So there's nothing pathogenic living in it. and soon it'll be vinegar. And I'll probably brew it out to 7% acidity, which will kill anything that it comes in contact with. So we have essentially a naturally pasteurized product without using heat to kill microbes that's been made using the enzymes from human saliva. We have not served this at the restaurant yet. This is just an obsessive experiment. But it's possible. Recently, just last week or 2 weeks ago, Bill Gates was on The Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon, and him and Jimmy were drinking poop water. I don't know if anybody saw that, but the Gates Foundation set out grants. They asked engineers to come up with affordable ways to filter out human wastewater to make clean drinking water. So, things keep going and we keep destroying the climate, and there's no more fresh water, we're all gonna be drinking poop water soon. So, these concepts, this way of thinking isn't so foreign. Essentially, it can be cutting edge. Another question I have with my obsession with this is, can this benefit our health? So this is my daughter. Her name is Amelia Morcella Luis, and one of her middle names is Morcella is Latin for morel mushrooms. That indicates my obsession with what I do. So I'm creating a living yogurt culture, started with my wife's breast milk, with a sample obtained from her sleeve there, with some of her spit up. So when babies are young, just like other mammals, there's a curdling process that happens, and they spit up and there's curds. It isn't like when we vomit, it's different. So the thought is, and this was a vetted concept that I discussed with her pediatrician. He's actually offered to co-author a paper with me on this, is to essentially create a personalized probiotic for my daughter for as she ages. So essentially, by taking a sample of her curdled spit up, inoculating it, keeping a living culture of yogurt, I actually have a personalized probiotic that's a direct reflection of her intestinal biosphere right now, at its peak health when she's young. This being the case, as she grows, inevitably she's going to need to take antibiotics. What happens when we take antibiotics? They kill off the good and the bad. A side effect of that can be diarrhea, loose stools, until that flora and fauna in our intestines is reestablished. So the thought is, with this personalized probiotic that I'm making for her, in the event that she has to take antibiotics or has IBS or any other intestinal issue, C. diff, anything like that, I can essentially maintain a culture indefinitely as long as I keep feeding it. Eventually I won't be able to feed it with breast milk. It'll probably switch to goat's milk because it's fairly similar to human breast milk. I'll be able to feed her own intestinal flora back to her medicinally. Not necessarily as a food, but that's the concept there. And when you dissect this and kind of look at where it's coming from, I got the idea from when we were having her, we were asked if we want to save her cord blood for stem cells. I'm like, well, what if I could preserve her intestines? Like, what if I could preserve something that's so integral to a daily being? Like, if you're having digestive issues, you have heartburn, you have indigestion, you have gas, if you're uncomfortable throughout the day, like you want to eat a healthy diet to maintain those systems. So I wanted to see if I could, essentially preserve a level of homeostasis for her that could help her reestablish if she ever had a problem. And now we're actually doing fecal transplants for people that are infected with C. diff, which is an infection that throws off the biosphere in your intestines. So it can be a very severe problem, and people are hospitalized with this. They're taking stool from healthy people and literally implanting it in the intestines of these sickened people, and it's not miraculously, but it's literally curing them essentially overnight. Those bacterial cultures are able to grow so fast and reestablish homeostasis. So will it work? I don't know. My daughter's going to be 12 weeks old on Saturday. My thought is, hopefully it will. So, I hope you're not grossed out by my obsessions and what I think about it at night. But this just expands too. Is food medicine? Are they separate worlds? The medical community and the eating community, like the food activism community, the good food community says, food is essentially medicine. Like maintaining a healthy diet is integral to us maintaining general health. So, I think experiments like these, looking at food production as a part of a whole system as opposed to eating as just something we do on the side, creating that climate of thought is really important for us to maintain health and hopefully healthy ecosystems and environments. So, and that's it. This is me. I'm pretty active this time of year. I'm like locked in the kitchen, but I'm pretty active on social media, especially during the foraging season. I can always be reached at my email or through any of those platforms. So, thank you very much. I hope I enjoyed it.